So just to get back to Mr. Benjamin Way, Mr. Benjamin Way was arrested, and this information is out online, so it's nothing secret here. Mr. Benjamin Way was arrested for fraud in 2015, charges dropped in 2017. Of course, he had a massive payout. He also had to make a massive payout of $5 million to an intern for alleged sexual assault. So is this the same gentleman that is pictured with the former central bank governor, Mr. Ajit Niwad Cabral?
Yes, in the briefing document that fintech/Hamilton Reserve Bank had sent to other creditors, it's him pictured with another Hamilton Reserve Bank executive with Cabral in that picture from their meeting.
Right, and your reporting seems to suggest that Way and his colleagues were relying on explicit guarantees from the central bank governor, which is not really how debt works, is it? I mean, it's quite something that he mentioned that in this presentation that he sent to other creditors. So that's probably why you mentioned that it seemed a bit amateurish. Do you want to go into that?
Yes. The whole presentation is not the kind of polished presentation you are used to sometimes in the financial world. But like sometimes this wasn't aimed to be public. But the idea that he would go to the central bank governor and say, essentially, do you promise to pay back your bond? And he'd say, yes, of course, because no central bank governor or finance minister or prime minister is ever going to say they're going to default before they actually default. It would be comical to suggest otherwise. And relying on that assurance seems, yes, amateurish. Like no central bank governor is going to tell a creditor. I mean, that would be highly suspicious if they told a private creditor in a private meeting that they are going to default before they actually do so. So the whole document seems odd and misunderstands parts of the process, which implies that this is not the way things are played out, is not how Benjamin Way and FinTech and Hamilton Reserve Bank initially planned things. It is my understanding of this.
Right.
They could still win from this. They do have, it seems, genuinely a blocking stake in that 2022 bond for Sri Lanka. So one specific bond that they can block from the restructuring. So in a normal debt restructuring, they have actually a strong hand in many respects. But it'd be interesting to see if the US government, yes, has views on the identity of the people behind this, and whether essentially Sri Lanka essentially does restructure, reaches a restructuring agreement with its commercial creditors and bilateral creditors, also Chinese loans and other country loans and so on. It's going to be arduous. Zambia spent 2 years restructuring its debts. It's still not completely done. And then maybe in time, they decide to just pay off Hamilton Reserve Bank or the people behind it in full to make that headache go away. That is possible. But I think they probably overplay their hand. So it's going to be fascinating to see how things shake out.
Well, the opposition in Sri Lanka had been alleging for some time during the period leading up to the default, asking the question, why is the finance ministry settling bondholders when we're eating into our reserves? We're running out of money to cover the import bill, the fuel bill, etc. And the obvious questions had been raised, so this is nothing that I'm asking you to speculate on, but the fact is that Mr. Ajit Niwad Cabral is a highly politicized figure within Sri Lanka. I mean, he was a politician. He's not an economist. He's a chartered accountant. He switched sides and then ended up being the governor of the central bank throughout the 2007-2008 period. And he was, in fact, a member of parliament sitting with the government on the side of the government. And then immediately, I think within a couple of days, he left parliament and took up the position of the governor of the central bank again. And everyone in Sri Lanka's financial sector sort of accepts that his appointment and reappointment is, in a way, a sort of politicization of the central bank, which in itself is dangerous. But opposition members of parliament had been asking the question, why are we settling these bonds? who are the bondholders? Do we need to conduct some sort of forensic analysis about who these bondholders are? Is there some kind of related party transaction going on, etc.? Have you seen something along those lines in your reporting around the world where you've uncovered this kind of it's not is it insider trading? I don't think you can call it insider trading, but certainly some related party transactions related to sovereign bonds. Is there something that you think feasibly could have happened in Sri Lanka? I'm not asking you to I'm just asking you to speculate if that's possible at all.
Yeah, I'll be very careful about speculating, because I mean, I do not know the domestic situation there well enough, and the background and the individual, the credibility of the people involved. But yes, sadly, in many cases through the history of debt crises, there have been opportunities for politicians, officials to enrich themselves somehow from the situation. Now, broadly speaking, the vast majority of the time when countries keep paying their debts longer than really they should, they're not doing so because they're corrupt. It's because in the same way that, bankrupt people also end up tending to stay current their mortgage longer than they really should, maybe, but longer than they really could. And it would be better if we all address problems earlier. But I've talked to a lot of lawyers. There's a guy called Lee Bukite, and it's called Too Little, Too Late. Like, all countries, broadly speaking, recognize the problems too late. They've run down their foreign exchange reserves, so they'll have nothing left. And then when they do restructure, eventually, they don't restructure tough enough. They don't kind of get enough debt relief. And this is the ongoing tragedy that is common for pretty much every country. So I don't think Sri Lanka has been unique in sort of delayed recognition of this problem. But there have been cases, mostly sort of speculated, there have been local lawsuits, there have been people thrown in jail occasionally, but in places like Pakistan, Argentina, Bolivia, there is a lot of opportunity for inside Ukraine in this debt restructuring in 2014-15. Broadly speaking, I'm not really aware of anybody who's actually been thrown in jail for anything like that. It's very hard to prove, and quite often, what we think of as insider trading, those are very concrete laws around stocks and equities and bonds and things like that. Government bonds is different. So there are opportunities to enrich yourself from these situations, sadly. I have no clue whether that is what's happened here. So it'd be hard to speculate beyond the fact that, yes, if you happen to know the timing of when you're going to restructure, how much you're going to restructure, how good an offer, you can either yourself or your friends benefit from that. But I'd say that what you're describing in Sri Lanka is not out of whack with what I've seen in many other countries. And people just recognize this too late. It's traumatic. Is you're admitting that you cannot pay your debts. And it's something that no finance minister, no prime minister, no president, no central bank governor ever wants to do. You do not want to be the person whose country defaulted on your watch. It's just hugely embarrassing. Yeah. So sometimes it's an Occam's razor situation. Sometimes the simplest answer is the easiest one.
Right. I just want to read out a brief report from Al Jazeera written in June 22 by Chris Dolmetsch. And it laid out that the Hamilton Reserve Bank accuses Sri Lankan government, including the Rajapaksa family, of orchestrating the debt default but excluding bonds held by domestic banks and other interested parties from an announced debt restructuring. As a result, these favored Sri Lankan parties stand to be paid principal and interest in full, while bonds held by American investors, including what he calls retirement systems, held by Fidelity Investments, BlackRock, T. Rowe Price, Lord Abbett, JP Morgan, etc. So I guess Hamilton Reserve Bank is kind of making an argument that there's a selective default going on. Is that sort of what they're saying?
That's what they're saying, and it's true, but it's not the full truth. So it's a classic tactic by these holdout creditors to hold up American pensioners as the kind of their human shield, as it were, and hide behind them. So, oh, you're not defaulting on us, an evil hedge fund. You're defaulting on these poor American teachers and pensioners. Right. Five and stuff like that. It's true, but it's kind of hokey. It's kind of desperate. And frankly, the BlackRocks, the T. Rows, they're big boys. They can handle themselves. They don't need hedge funds fighting their fights. And broadly speaking, they are of the view in debt restructuring. They don't want they have a fiduciary duty to protect their investors, pension plans and sovereign wealth funds and so on. But broadly speaking, they don't want to be stuck in a debt restructure for 2 years. They want to restructure a bond, don't give too much debt relief away, but some, so a country can return to health. So that is good for them in the long run. So I think that is an excuse. On the domestic debts, that is true, but again, it's not the full truth. So, countries have lots of different debts. When we talk about countries' debts, they come in different forms. There are bonds that are tradable. There are loans. There are bonds to Americans and international investors denominated in dollars and euros. There are bonds sometimes that are domiciled legally in New York or the UK typically. And there are domestic bonds typically issued locally to local banks, pension plans, insurance companies in the domestic currency under your own local law. So the debt restructuring game is complicated because, first of all, domestic debts have never really been considered a problem because fundamentally dealing with it is actually quite easy. Because as long as you control the government, you can do whatever you want with them. Like if I was like Sri Lankan, I had complete control of the parliament. I could, in theory, pass a law that says all domestic law bonds are worth 0. Now, you don't do that because it would mean every single local bank, insurance company, and pension plan would be bankrupt overnight. But you can do restructuring local debts is not difficult. And that's why, people quite often, when you look at the big literature around this, there isn't much about it. Increasingly, however, domestic debts have become bigger because there are just more countries that develop local bond markets. And also international investors have invested in that, which causes also other economic issues. The main problem with domestic debts and why it's hard to restructure is that point I made that you might bankrupt the domestic financial system. That you can restructure it, but by doing so, you might be, it's like you have a fly in your foot and you take a shotgun to take it off. You might blow off your own foot doing so. You will cause more economic carnage by trying to restructure your domestic debts, at least doing a proper debt restructuring of your domestic debts and the international debts. Also, fundamentally, if you have domestic debts in your domestic currency, you can just print that currency. The central bank can print that money, which is why it's kind of hard to ever really have a proper default on your own currency debts. Foreign currency debt, so US dollar bonds, Sri Lanka only has finite amount of hard currency reserves that it also needs to pay for medicine, fuel, food, anything it buys from abroad, it needs dollars for, euros for, yen for, renminbi for, which is why quite often debt restructurings, yes, do revolve around the external debt, the dollar-denominated debt. But we have seen quite often domestic debt investors, and some of them are T. Rowe Prices, BlackRocks, big pension plans in the domestic, they shouldn't be allowed to get away scot-free just because they invest in the domestic debt. But what typically happens is a country doesn't actually restructure that debt properly. What they do, they extend the maturities and lower the interest rates. So they go to all the banks and say, look, you're going to sign up to all this debt that is on average maturing in 10 years. Well, now it's going to mature in 20 years, and the interest rate is going to go from 6% to 1% a year. So the actual nominal size of the debt stays exactly the same, but the value and the burden of it on the taxpayers is minimized. Or they just print something and the value of that debt de facto becomes less because you printed money to pay it, which is why, again, Hampton Reserve Bank, other creditors also complain about this. This was an issue in Zambia. It's become an issue in Ghana. And I suspect the fight between external bondholders and domestic bondholders is going to become a bigger issue, more debt restructurings. But it's still fundamentally they're trying to play whataboutism, essentially. Well, what about these people? How can you not restructure them if you're going to restructure us? Well, because you have finite hard currency reserves, and you have many other tools you can use with the domestic debt. The harder problem for Sri Lanka, and we've seen this in Zambia, is going to be what to do about Chinese loans. that is also going to be a growing factor in a lot of countries, Egypt, Pakistan, Zambia, Sri Lanka, and elsewhere, that China's gone on a lending spree, and China does not like to restructure its debts. So that is a bit of a pain point right now.
Okay. Well, Robin, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. And thank you for your reporting, and you and your colleagues. I think especially the information around Benjamin Way, I don't think would have really come out this soon if it weren't for your reporting. So thanks again for that. And thanks for being on Insight. And I'll be in touch with you on email, and I'll send you the clips of the recording once we've done all the edits. So Robin Wigglesworth of the Financial Times, thank you very much for being on Insight. Appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me, Kusum. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you. Have a good day. Cheers.
You too. Bye.